In September of 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, Bomber Command possessed just 53 squadrons. Of these, only 33 were considered fully operational, and 10 of those were immediately dispatched to France to accompany the British Expeditionary Force, leaving barely 24 squadrons to defend and strike from the British Isles. The aircraft these squadrons flew were a generation behind what modern warfare demanded. Blenheims, Hamptons, Wellingtons, Whitleys, and ferry battles, all of them at least 6 years old in concept, designed in an era when the theory of strategic bombing was still largely untested. When air war was still the stuff of speculation and peacetime exercises, they were slow, they were underarmed, their bomb loads were modest, and their range was limited. With little more than 300 first-line bombers based in Britain, Bomber Command was clearly incapable of pursuing any true bombing offensive against Germany. But there was a deeper problem than numbers and machines. There was a theory, a belief that had been enshrined in RAF doctrine throughout the 1930s, that the bomber would always get through, that tightly formed groups of bombers, flying in daylight, could defend themselves against fighter attack with their own defensive armament, that they could find their targets, bomb them accurately, and return home without the need for fighter escort. It was a theory born of peacetime optimism, and it was about to be destroyed by the reality of war. Throughout the winter months of 1939 to 40, RAF bombers were dispatched in tiny formations on what were termed armed reconnaissance sorties. The young crews, maintaining the tight formations advocated by the bomber hierarchy, ventured over the North Sea and into German airspace with a confidence that was tragically misplaced. They were quickly disillusioned about their defensive capabilities. The disastrous results of these early raids revealed the inadequacy of the unescorted bomber theory with brutal clarity. German fighters, principally the Messerschmitt 109, tore into the slow-moving British formations with devastating efficiency. Bomber after bomber was shot from the sky. The losses were not just heavy, they were unsustainable. On some raids, a third or more of the attacking force failed to return. The young crews, many of them barely out of training, learned the hardest possible lesson, that the theories they had been taught were wrong, and that the price of being wrong in war was death. The disastrous results forced the RAF to restrict its bombing to night raids in future. Under cover of darkness, the bombers had a better chance of surviving, but darkness brought its own problems. Finding a target in daylight was difficult enough. Finding one at night, over blacked-out enemy territory, with only a compass and the stars for guidance, was a challenge that would take years and thousands of lives to master. And yet, even in those dark early months, Bomber Command was laying the foundations for what would eventually become the most sustained and devastating aerial campaign in history. Lessons were being learned. New tactics were being developed, and somewhere in the factories of Britain, the aircraft that would transform the bombing war were already taking shape on the drawing boards and the assembly lines. The question was whether Bomber Command could survive long enough to use them. The crews who flew those early missions carried a burden that went beyond the physical dangers of combat. They were pioneers in a form of warfare that had never been attempted on this scale. Everything was new. Everything was uncertain. The navigation techniques they used were primitive dead reckoning, compass bearings, and whatever landmarks they could identify through gaps in the cloud. On a clear night, with a full moon, they might be able to follow a river or a coastline to their target. On a cloudy night, they were essentially flying blind, trusting their calculations and hoping they were somewhere close to where they needed to be. The cold was another enemy. At altitude, and the constant vibration of the engines, hour after hour, drained the energy and concentration of even the most experienced crews. And always, there was the knowledge that they might not come back. Every briefing room, every dispersal hut, every crew room on every bomber station had its empty chairs, the places where friends had sat yesterday, friends who had not returned, friends whose names would be spoken quietly and then, gradually, not spoken at all. The turnover was relentless. New faces appeared, old faces vanished, and the war went on. On the 16th and 17th of December, 1940, in what was possibly their last significant raid of that year, RAF Bomber Command marked a new and controversial departure in the air war. The aiming point for the 134 aircraft dispatched that night was not any industrial area or individual building. It was the very center of the town of Mannheim. This was a reprisal raid carried out in direct retaliation for the bombing of Coventry and other British towns, and it represented a fundamental shift in policy. Until now, Bomber Command had officially been targeting military and industrial objectives. Mannheim was different. This was the first purely urban attack, the largest number of British bombers sent to date against a single target, with the explicit aim of hitting the town itself. The first 14 Wellingtons were sent in carrying incendiary bombs, their mission to set the town alight and mark the target with fire. The rest of the bomber force followed the glare of the flames, dropping their high explosives into the glow below. At a cost of only 3 aircraft lost and 4 more that crashed on return, the force destroyed 476 buildings, killed 47 people, and made a further 12,166 homeless. The tactic of using fire as a marker had proven its worth. It would become a cornerstone of Bomber Command's strategy. 1941 opened for Bomber Command with a raid on the very first day of the year. More than 100 aircraft took off to bomb the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory and other industrial targets in the city of Bremen. The raid was a success, and the losses to the RAF were slight. In fact, the year began with a new directive, which was a continuation of the one issued at the end of 1940. Oil was the primary target. Germany's war machine ran on oil, its tanks, its aircraft, its U-boats, its transport. Destroy the oil, and the machine would grind to a halt. The logic was impeccable. The execution, however, was another matter entirely. The poor weather conditions of that winter were still hampering operations. Clouds obscured the targets. Navigation was unreliable. Bombs fell on open fields, on forests, on anything except the factories they were aimed at. In March, another diversion arose, pulling bombing away from those primary oil targets for the following 4 months. The priority now was to defeat Germany's attempt to cut off Britain's food supplies and her connection with the United States. The Battle of the Atlantic was reaching a critical phase, and the U-boats were sinking merchant shipping at an alarming rate. The Admiralty, absorbed almost entirely in its campaign against the German submarines threatening Britain's lifelines, pleaded strongly for bomber squadrons to be employed against the U-boat bases and especially the German capital ships Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen, which were based at Brest. By mid-March of 1941, 17 new squadrons had been added to the force, and even more importantly, the first of the new type of heavy bombers were trickling into service. These were the aircraft that the designers had been working on since before the war. Bigger, faster, capable of carrying heavier bomb loads over greater distances. They were still arriving in small numbers, but they represented the future. The high-capacity bomb, known as the HC, made its debut when, on March the 31st, 2 4,000-pound HC bombs were dropped on Emden by specially modified Wellingtons. These enormous weapons, each weighing nearly 2 tons, were a quantum leap from the modest bombs of the early war. They were complemented by an increasing variety of incendiary bombs, often fitted with explosive charges that would scatter burning material over a wide area. But the raid on Bremen, on the 27th to 28th of June, revealed a disturbing new development in the enemy's defenses. German night fighters were now operating in large numbers. The result was the highest number of bombers lost in a night raid so far, 14 aircraft out of a force of 108. The night sky over Germany, which had offered relative safety compared to the lethal daylight, was becoming a killing ground of its own. By July, the air staff was free to return to a strategic bombing campaign. It was clear that the earlier campaign against oil installations had caused little damage and no major effect on production. In a directive issued on the 9th of July, 1941, Bomber Command was ordered to dislocate the German transportation system, isolating industrial regions and preventing the movement of war materials to the front. In November, 105 Squadron received its first example of a revolutionary new aircraft, the de Havilland Mosquito, an all-wood bomber of extraordinary speed and versatility. It was the harbinger of a host of Mosquito variants that were to become a major factor in the strategic bombing offensive against Germany. Fast enough to outrun most fighters, agile enough to fly at low level or at great altitude, the Mosquito would prove to be one of the most adaptable and effective aircraft of the entire war. A momentous turning point for Bomber Command came on February the 20th, 1942, when a new commander took up his appointment. His name was Air Marshal Arthur Harris. He was blunt, stubborn, single-minded, and utterly convinced that strategic bombing could win the war. He would become the most controversial figure in the history of the air war, admired by his crews, respected by his enemies, and debated by historians for generations. But there was no question about one thing. Arthur Harris transformed Bomber Command from a blunt instrument into a weapon of devastating precision and power. Just 6 days before Harris took command, a directive emanating from the Air Staff and sanctioned by the War Cabinet had ordered Bomber Command to commence a prolonged aerial bombing campaign whereby large targets such as industrial towns and cities were to become primary targets. For night bombing, the debate about whether to bomb specific military targets or entire industrial areas had been settled by necessity as much as by strategy. Bomber Command simply could not hit individual factories at night with any consistency, but it could hit cities, and so cities became the targets. Harris wasted no time. On the 8th and 9th of March, and for the following 2 nights, bombers led by the new G navigational system hit the town of Essen. G proved itself as an excellent navigational aid, but the crews found it was not precise enough for the blind bombing of specific targets. On the 13th and 14th of March, after a raid on Kiel, Harris turned to another of his 4 major targets, the city of Cologne. Cologne was hit by 135 aircraft, which managed to start 237 fires, destroy several factories, and damage over 1,500 houses. But Essen remained the #1 target home to the vast Krupp armaments works, the industrial heart of the German war machine. Over the next 2 weeks, Harris made 5 more attempts to hit it. Each time, the industrial haze that hung over the Ruhr Valley, combined with the limitations of available navigation technology, made accurate bombing almost impossible. Harris was learning that determination alone was not enough. He needed better tools, better tactics, and above all, more aircraft. And then came the night that changed everything. On the night of the 30th and 31st of May, 1942, a total of 1,046 bombers took off in 2 waves from airfields throughout the east of England. Their destination was Cologne. They were preceded by 88 aircraft on intruder and diversionary sorties to confuse the German defenses. It was an audacious gamble. Harris had scraped together every aircraft he could find, not just frontline bombers, but training aircraft, reserve aircraft, anything that could carry a bomb and fly to Germany. He was staking everything on a single, massive blow. Never before had the German night fighters been offered such a golden opportunity. Over 1,000 bombers streaming across the North Sea in a concentrated river of aircraft, but no fighters came. Hitler, against the advice of his commanders, had made another of his costly mistakes. He had forbidden the Luftwaffe to attack the RAF over British soil. Had he not given this order, this raid could not only have been the first 1,000-bomber raid, but also the last and possibly the costliest raid ever for Bomber Command. The first of the bombers were spotted on German radar as they passed over the Dutch coast. There was surprisingly little resistance from the night fighters, although there was considerable flak. The bombers converged on the center of the city. They came in and bombed at a rate of 1 aircraft every 6 seconds. Incendiaries crashed downward, splashing brilliant white as they hit the ground. For the bombers still coming in, the red glare below was like daylight. The people of Cologne were now finding a bitter meaning in the words of propaganda minister Dr. Goebbels, "We are all in the front line now." The bomber stream turned for home, leaving behind a city that was burning from end to end. The fires were visible from the Dutch coast, a dull orange glow on the southern horizon that the returning crews could see for over 100 miles. Below them, Cologne was wrapped in a shroud of smoke and flame that rose thousands of feet into the night sky. 13,000 homes had been destroyed. 45,000 people were now homeless. 1,500 factories were obliterated beyond repair, and 630 more were seriously damaged. In a single night, Bomber Command had inflicted more damage on one city than it had achieved in the previous 2 years of bombing combined. Harris had proved his point. The era of the 1,000-bomber raid had begun. Harris had achieved his prime objectives and received approval for the future massive expansion of the force. This night marked a turning point for Bomber Command, the moment it transformed from a struggling, under-equipped force into a strategic weapon that could reshape the landscape of war. In August of 1942, A new formation of huge significance came into being when the Pathfinder Force was inaugurated. Its purpose was succinct and vital: to spearhead main bombing sorties and locate and mark the target accurately before the main bomber stream arrived. The Pathfinders were the elite of Bomber Command, the best navigators, the most experienced crews, flying the most capable aircraft. Their job was to find the target in the darkness, drop colored marker flares to illuminate it, and then guide the hundreds of following bombers onto the aiming point. It was a concept born of painful experience. Raid after raid had shown that the majority of bomber crews, flying in darkness over hostile territory, simply could not find their targets. Post-raid reconnaissance photographs had revealed the humiliating truth. Bombs were falling miles from their intended aiming points, sometimes in open countryside, sometimes on the wrong town entirely. A report commissioned in 1941, known as the Butt Report, had delivered the devastating conclusion that only 1 in 3 aircraft that claimed to have attacked their target had actually dropped bombs within 5 miles of it. In the vast industrial landscape of the Ruhr, that could mean the difference between hitting a factory and hitting a field. The Pathfinder Force was the answer to this damning revelation, a dedicated group of specialists whose sole purpose was to ensure that the main force's bombs fell where they were supposed to. As 1942 drew to a close, Harris now had a force that was considerably stronger than the one he had inherited 10 months earlier. The Cologne raid had proved that accuracy in hitting the target had increased by 30%. New aircraft, new navigation aids, new tactics, and the growing experience of the crews were all contributing to a force that was becoming more effective with every passing month. Lancasters, led by Pathfinders, found and attacked with some success Dusseldorf, Duisburg, and Essen, targets that had frustrated Bomber Command for years. A total of 43 major raids were mounted between March and June of 1943. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, was being systematically pounded. The last blows of the Ruhr campaign came on the 25th and 26th of July, when Harris sent 705 aircraft to bomb Essen, and the final raid on the 30th and 31st of July, when a force of 273 aircraft hit the town of Remscheid, a Ruhr town not previously attacked. 4/5 of the built-up area was destroyed, and over 100 factories and commercial buildings were put out of action. And then, on the night of May the 16th and 17th, 1943, came one of the most audacious operations in the history of aerial warfare. 19 specially modified Lancasters of the recently formed 617 Squadron attacked the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams using precise low-level attack methods and specially constructed cylindrical explosive canisters designed by the inventor Barnes Wallis. The Dam Busters raid, as it became known, captured the public imagination like no other operation of the war, but the cost was high. 8 of the 19 Lancasters were lost, along with 53 of the finest aircrew in Bomber Command. It was a ratio of losses that would have been unsustainable in a prolonged campaign, but as a single spectacular blow against the German war machine, it was without equal. By the summer of 1943, Bomber Command had been joined in its offensives by the B-17S and B-24S of the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force. The Americans concentrated on daylight sorties, flying in tight box formations that bristled with defensive machine guns, believing, as the RAF had once believed, that heavily armed bombers could defend themselves in daylight. Initially, this approach forced them to suffer a high casualty rate. The German fighters, experienced and aggressive, exploited every weakness in the American formations. But these heavy daylight raids complemented Harris's nightly onslaught. Germany was now being bombed around the clock by the Americans during the day, and by the British at night. There was no respite. This combined bomber offensive was authorized by a fresh directive from the Combined Chiefs of Staff named Point Blank, dated June the 10th, 1943, expressing concern over the mounting casualties caused by the enlarging and increasingly efficient Luftwaffe fighter defenses. Point Blank called for a switch in concentration to targets directly related to those fighters and their supporting industry. But Harris had a different target in mind. As the second most important city of Germany, Hamburg offered great possibilities for area destruction. In 1943, Hamburg was the largest port in Europe and Germany's second largest city, with a population of around 1 million. It was a sprawling metropolis of docks and warehouses, factories and shipyards, residential districts, and commercial centers, and it was about to experience something the world had never seen before. 80 miles from the German coast, the night fighters, guided to their targets by ground controllers who could no longer distinguish real bombers from strips of tinfoil, groped helplessly through the night. Window had paralyzed the German air defense system at a stroke. The effect was immediate and devastating. Bomber losses over Hamburg were dramatically lower than they would otherwise have been. All but 63 of the 791 aircraft dropped 2,277 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs into the built-up areas of the city and port. The destruction was immense, but it was only the beginning, for the fires that had started with the incendiary devices did not burn out. They grew, they fed on themselves. Hamburg experienced the world's first firestorm. The weather had been very hot and dry, which caused the timber-framed buildings to burn with ferocious ease. The individual fires from thousands of incendiary bombs spread and joined together, growing from scattered blazes into one colossal inferno. The rising heat was so intense that it created a violent updraft, a column of superheated air that rose thousands of feet into the sky. The temperatures at the heart of the firestorm reached 800 degrees. Asphalt roads melted and bubbled. Glass windows shattered from the heat alone. People in their shelters were suffocated as the fire consumed all the oxygen in the air above them. The inferno raged for hours, consuming entire districts, reducing blocks of apartments to ash, melting the steel frames of factories, turning the canals to steam. 2 further raids completed the fearful destruction of the ancient city. The Battle of Hamburg was one of the most concentrated and successful series of operations undertaken by Bomber Command. In terms of destruction, the results were unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. The scale of what happened at Hamburg sent shockwaves through the German leadership. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later stated that 6 more attacks on that scale against other major German cities would have brought the German war effort to a complete halt. The industrial output of Hamburg was devastated. Shipyards that had been producing U-boats were reduced to twisted metal. Refineries that had been processing oil were flattened. The city's population, traumatized beyond anything they had ever experienced, fled in their hundreds of thousands, streaming out along the roads in a mass exodus that overwhelmed the surrounding towns and villages. For the crews of Bomber Command, Hamburg was a vindication. It proved that strategic bombing could inflict damage on a scale that genuinely threatened Germany's ability to wage war. In the summer of 1943, with the outcome of the war still very much in doubt, the priority was to keep bombing, and that was exactly what Harris intended to do. Harris's next objective was Berlin, the big city, as it was known by the bomber crews. Harris believed that if he could destroy Berlin, he could end the war. It was a claim that would prove to be overly optimistic, but the campaign he launched against the German capital was nonetheless one of the most sustained and brutal aerial offensives of the war. Beginning on November the 18th and 19th, 1943, a total of 16 major raids were sent against Berlin. The German capital was a vast target, one of the largest cities in Europe, spread over hundreds of square miles, heavily defended by flak batteries and night fighters, and far deeper into German territory than Hamburg or the Ruhr cities. The crews who flew to Berlin faced the longest, most dangerous flights of the war, hours over hostile territory, through belts of searchlights and flak, hunted by night fighters that had grown increasingly sophisticated in their tactics. These raids devastated over 2,000 acres of Berlin, killed nearly 6,000 inhabitants, and rendered 1.5 million Germans homeless. The government district was hit, factories were destroyed, railway yards were torn apart, residential districts were reduced to rubble, but Berlin was simply too vast, too spread out, and too heavily defended to be destroyed the way Hamburg had been. The firestorm conditions that had consumed Hamburg could not be replicated in Berlin's wider streets and more modern construction. The cost to Bomber Command was not light. 492 bombers and their crews were listed as missing during the Berlin campaign. Each of those aircraft carried a crew of 7 men. The mathematics of loss were relentless and merciless. Nearly 3,500 young men killed, captured, or missing in action during a single campaign against a single city. It was a price that tested even Harris's iron resolve. For the crews who flew to Berlin night after night, The experience was a descent into a particular kind of hell. The route took them deep into Germany, across hundreds of miles of enemy territory defended by the most sophisticated air defenses in the world. The German night fighter force had evolved from a handful of improvised units into a highly effective killing machine, equipped with airborne radar and guided by a network of ground controllers who tracked the bomber stream with deadly accuracy. The flak over Berlin itself was the heaviest in Germany. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns ringed the city. The searchlights probed the sky in their dozens, sweeping back and forth, hunting for victims. The men who survived a full tour of 30 operations over Berlin considered themselves among the luckiest people alive. Statistically, they probably were. The point-blank plan, which had begun in early 1943, culminated in late February of 1944 in one of the most intense periods of bombing in the entire war. For 6 days and nights, Bomber Command and the United States 8th Air Force combined in what became known as the Big Week, dropping 16,506 tons of bombs on Germany. The targets were the aircraft factories, the engine plants, and the assembly lines that were producing the fighters that defended the Reich. The Big Week was a turning point in the air war over Europe. The combined weight of British night bombing and American daylight precision attacks inflicted severe damage on the German aircraft industry. But more importantly, the air battles fought during the Big Week drew the Luftwaffe's fighters into combat, where they were destroyed in large numbers. Germany could replace aircraft. It could not so easily replace the experienced pilots who flew them. In preparation for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, a new directive came for Bomber Command in the spring of 1944. This was known as the Transportation Plan. Knowing how dependent the German armies were on the railways for moving troops, tanks, ammunition, and supplies, this was a plan for a major assault on the rail transport systems of Western Europe. The aim was to create a railway void between Western Germany and the French coast, so that when the invasion came, the Germans would be unable to rush reinforcements to the beachheads. This task was split between Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force. In all, from the opening assault until the final D-Day blow on the 2nd and 3rd of June, Bomber Command put in 69 such attacks. The damage caused was enormous. From Cologne and Aachen through Ghent and Courtrai to the centers around Paris and as far afield as Le Mans and Orléans, the railways became scenes of desolation. Marshalling yards were cratered. Locomotive sheds were destroyed, bridges were dropped into rivers. The rail network of northern France, which the Germans needed to function at full capacity, was reduced to chaos. The transportation plan was controversial. Some senior commanders argued that Bomber Command's heavy bombers were wasted on railway targets, that the strategic offensive against German industry should continue without interruption. Others worried about the inevitable French civilian casualties that would result from bombing railway centers in populated areas, but the results spoke for themselves. When the Allied armies stormed ashore on the 6th of June, 1944, the German ability to move reinforcements to Normandy was crippled. Panzer divisions that should have reached the beachheads within hours took days or even weeks, forced to make long detours around destroyed bridges and cratered junctions, harassed by Allied aircraft at every turn. The transportation plan had done exactly what it was designed to do. The German war machine was being brought to a standstill. Bomber Command continued its highly productive mine-laying operations, sowing the waters around German ports with thousands of magnetic and acoustic mines that sank shipping and closed harbors. They attacked U-boat pens with enormous tallboy bombs designed to penetrate the thick concrete roofs. They hit the coastal cities of Königsberg, Stettin, Bremen, Emden, Kiel, and Wilhelmshaven. By early 1945, German oil and fuel production had diminished to a relative trickle, starving the aircraft, tanks, and transports that were still desperately fighting on all fronts. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe's remaining fighters sat impotent on their airfields. Without fuel, the panzer divisions that had once swept across Europe could barely move. Without fuel, the transport networks that kept the German armies supplied ground to a halt. Pilots who had been trained at great expense could not fly. Tanks that had been manufactured with enormous effort could not fight. The lifeblood of the German war machine was draining away, drop by drop, raid by raid, and there was nothing the German High Command could do to stop it. Harris continued to adhere to his personal conviction of area bombing of large industrial objectives, but even he acknowledged that the oil campaign was producing results that exceeded anything area bombing had achieved. The combination of the two approaches, area bombing to destroy industrial capacity and morale, precision attacks on oil to starve the war machine of fuel, created a cumulative effect that was, by early 1945, bringing Germany to its knees. Harris continued to adhere to his personal conviction of area bombing of large industrial objectives, but a new military situation was emerging. The successful Russian offensive, which had begun in mid-January of 1945, was driving westward through Poland and Silesia at a pace that astonished both sides. As the Russians advanced, it became apparent that air attacks on the East German cities which confronted them might be of powerful assistance to the Soviet drive. At the Allied conference at Yalta, the Russians requested Allied cooperation in the mass bombing of all communications in eastern Germany to prevent any reinforcement of the German Eastern Front. They wanted these attacks within an agreed bomb line to keep the British and American air forces away from any territory they might soon occupy. Following a few days of bad weather, on the 13th of February, 1945, Bomber Command was ready for the assault on an unsuspecting German city, a city that, until this night, had been largely spared the devastation that had consumed so many others. A city of Baroque architecture and porcelain factories, of art galleries and churches, of refugees fleeing the advancing Russian armies. A city that had come to believe, with a faith that proved tragically misplaced, that it was too beautiful, too culturally significant, too far from the industrial heartland to be a target. The city was Dresden. After a 10-hour flight, the first wave of bombers approached the city in the darkness of a winter's night. The city below was ill-prepared for its fate. Its anti-aircraft defenses were minimal. Its fire services were not equipped for a major raid. The resulting fires could be seen from a distance of 80 kilometers. As at Hamburg, the incendiaries created a firestorm that consumed entire districts. The city, packed with refugees who had fled westward from the Russian advance, was a tinderbox. The narrow medieval streets and timber-framed buildings fed the flames, and the firestorm generated its own terrible winds, drawing oxygen from the shelters below and replacing it with smoke and carbon monoxide. Many people had died in the shelters under the crushing weight of fallen masonry. Many more were trapped, but the rescue workers could not reach them in time, and hundreds perished from asphyxiation. In the days that followed, the photographs from Dresden circled the world: the ruined Frauenkirche, the blackened skeleton of the city center, the long lines of corpses laid out in the streets for identification. For the first time, serious questions were being asked not just by the enemy, but by the Allied press and public about whether the strategic bombing campaign had crossed a line, whether the destruction of a city of such cultural significance, so late in a war that was clearly already won, could be justified by any military logic. Even Churchill, who had been one of the strongest advocates of strategic bombing throughout the war, distanced himself from Dresden in its aftermath. The moral reckoning that the bombing campaign had been deferring for years had finally arrived, and it would cast a shadow over the legacy of Bomber Command that persists to this day. The bombing of Dresden ignited a debate that has never been resolved. Was it militarily justified? Was it a legitimate attack on a transportation hub through which German reinforcements were flowing to the Eastern Front? Or was it an act of wanton destruction against a city of no significant military value, filled with refugees and civilians? What is beyond dispute is the scale of what Bomber Command achieved over the course of the war, and the price it paid. From those first, fumbling raids of 1939, when a handful of obsolete aircraft ventured tentatively over the North Sea, to the 1,000-bomber raids over Cologne and the firestorms over Hamburg and Dresden, Bomber Command underwent a transformation without parallel in military history. The force that Arthur Harris commanded by 1945 bore almost no resemblance to the one that had existed when war broke out. The small formations of 30 or 40 aircraft had given way to streams of 1,000 or more. The crude, inaccurate bombing of 1940 had evolved into the sophisticated Pathfinder-led, marker-guided attacks of 1944. The strategic bombing offensive against Germany remains one of the most debated aspects of the Second World War. Its proponents argue that it diverted enormous German resources into air defense. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns that could have been used on the Eastern Front, hundreds of fighter aircraft that could have opposed the Allied armies, millions of man-hours devoted to repair and civil defense, rather than war production. They argue that the destruction of oil production, transportation networks, and industrial capacity shortened the war by months, perhaps years, and saved countless lives on all sides. Its critics point to the civilian casualties, the hundreds of thousands of German men, women, and children who died under the bombs. They point to cities like Dresden and Hamburg, where the destruction seemed to go far beyond any military necessity. They argue that the resources devoted to strategic bombing might have been better used elsewhere, and that the campaign's moral cost was too high, in a place that offers comfort to no one. What cannot be disputed is the courage of the men who flew the missions. Night after night, they climbed into their Lancasters and Halifaxes and Mosquitoes and flew into the darkness, knowing that the odds were against them, knowing that on any given night, the searchlights might find them, the flak might hit them, the night fighters might catch them. They flew in freezing temperatures at 20,000 feet, in unpressurized cabins, wearing oxygen masks, watching for the telltale exhaust flame of a night fighter closing from behind. Many of them were barely out of their teens. They came from Britain, from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa, from the Caribbean, from every corner of the Commonwealth and beyond. They volunteered for the most dangerous job in the Allied forces, and nearly half of them did not come home.